This video is going to complete the evidence of evolution notes. We're starting just under the map that you had completed last time on what is page 5 in my notes. Under the map it says what is comparative morphology, aka comparative anatomy, and so that's where I'm starting. Now what I want you guys to think about as we look at comparative anatomy is you have similarities to your parents and your grandparents. Like you've probably heard the saying, she has her mother's eyes, or he has his father's nose, or something along those lines. Well, the same thing can be held true when you start to look at broader features over more different species of animals. So in the picture that you're looking at right here, you're looking at the arm bones of a whole bunch of different vertebrates. Vertebrates are animals that have a backbone, and what they have done is tried to color code some of the things that are on there. So for example, I'm going to start with human because maybe you guys learned some human stuff as you guys were going through high school biology. We have a humerus that's in our upper arm. We have a radius and an ulna in our forearm. We have carpals, which are the wrist bones, and then we have phalanges, which are our finger bones. Well, if you look at the bones of other vertebrates, even though a porpoise just has flippers and they could have just one bone down the flipper, they still have a humerus, a radius, an ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and then phalanges. And so they've got that same basic arrangement, and that indicates relationship between the organisms. So comparative anatomy are features that are similar between different species because they shared a common ancestor. And it's a fairly strong piece of evidence. Just like we can make family trees and pedigrees for human beings, we can make something called a phylogenetic tree looking at comparative features that are similar between different species of organisms. Another piece of evidence that helps support the idea of evolution are structures called vestigial structures or vestigial organs. They are organs that have no current function, but we still make them because our common ancestor made them and they had a function in that common ancestor. So in the picture that I'm showing you right here, this is a mole. Moles live underground where it's super duper dark. Because it's so dark, there's not enough light in there for them to be able to see anything, and yet this mole still makes an eye. It's a vestigial eye, it does not see anything, and yet they still make that structure. And so they're spending energy to make a structure that has no function, and it has gotten a lot smaller over time, but it's still there. That's a vestigial organ, and it indicates a relationship with an organism or an ancestor that had an eye that had a function. Now, a lot of times when you hear vestigial organs in high school, they tell you something like the appendix is a vestigial structure, but the appendix does have a function even today, so it's not really a good example. The example instead that I will give you for human beings is, our common ancestor had a lot more hair all over the body, and so attached to the hair follicles, we have this muscle called the erector pili. When we were cold, that muscle would contract and it would help us fluff our coats, essentially, so we could get warm. Well, now we don't have as much hair all over our bodies anymore. Definitely we don't have a coat that we can fluff, and yet we still contract this little muscle to help us try to fluff our coats. You see that as goosebumps on your skin. Goosebumps don't actually help you get any warmer. So that's a vestigial structure, the erector pili, doing something that it's supposed to do back when we had that thick coat, but it doesn't serve a function for us anymore. And so again, it shows relatedness with an organism that had a hairier body than we currently do. Next up, you have what are fossils. So fossils are things that you can dig up usually. Sometimes it's at the bottom of an ocean, so they find things at the bottom of an ocean. I think I'll show you a picture of that later on. I don't remember if I put that picture in here, but fossils do show you change in organisms over time. Some of the issues that go along with fossils are not everything fossilizes. You tend to have a hard body in order to fossilize really well. Sometimes we have really good fossil records of things, and sometimes we don't. For human beings, we've got a pretty good fossil record that goes back millions of years that shows us how we made it from like Ardipithecus and Australopithecus to Homo sapiens that we are currently. Now this is from National Geographic, and it shows you how we got from a terrestrial, what's known as tetrapod or four-legged animal, to modern whales that again still have these vestigial leg bones down here that serve no common purpose. There's not even a flipper in there. It doesn't do anything. But it's the same bones that they had that helped them walk around while they were on land. And so we're starting to get a more complete fossil record that shows us how we got from tetrapods to modern marine mammals like whales. So how do they actually provide evidence? They do show us that change over time. And again, millions of years. Fossils can show us change over millions, even billions of years in the case of major change between cells. Typically speaking, the fossil record shows simpler organisms growing more complex over time. So that's kind of how that's going to work. So this is a very old plant that existed way back in the day. I don't actually know the time. But it had no vascular tissue. It had to stay very small because it didn't have vascular tissue. It had to grow near water because it couldn't really move water around in its body very well. It's kind of like the Elodia that you guys looked at in lab as you were looking at cell structure, but it's not the same species. Another thing that they can do is show us organisms that don't exist anymore. Like this fish, you can't find it swimming around in our oceans anymore, and yet we have a nice little skeletal arrangement. It shows us that this fish had teeth in its jaws. They still had an operculum to help them move water over their gills so they could live a stationary life. It was what's known as a Rayfinned fish. These are rays, and so the fin would have come up over here, and so you can see a lot about this organism because of the fossils and know that that organism doesn't exist today. What did Cuvier propose? So I've got the little blurb that's on here. Make sure you get that jazz written down on here. But he was one of the first people that proposed that species do go extinct over time. That was a big thing because prior to this, people thought that God put the species on the planet and they stayed on this planet. He's basically saying, no, that's just not true. Now, he was also going to argue that geologic forces like volcanism, and he didn't know it at the time, but the continents moving around, that can help explain how different species are found in different places. Let's see. Lamarck. Lamarck is often considered to be a joke among biologists, but he was one of the first people to suggest that species do change over time. He called it the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And what he the analogy that they usually use, again going back to high school, is the ancestor to a giraffe needed to stretch higher in a tree, and so it stretched its neck out so it could reach the higher branches, and then it passed the longer neck on to its offspring. So one giraffe acquired a longer neck and then passed that on to their offspring. So here's the reason why he's still talked about today. One of the first people who said things change over time, but you can't inherit an acquired characteristics. And here's an example that I'm going to explain about why Lamarck was wrong. Foot binding used to be a practice that was practiced in Asia. Having a smaller foot was considered to be a desirable trait. And so the women would tie and bind their feet to make them appear smaller. So just to kind of orient you, this is her pinky toe, her second to the last toe, and so on. That's her actual big toe. So she has literally wrapped her toes around the bottom of her feet. She has dislocated joints and broken bones in order to make this happen. Also, she could fit into these tiny, adorable shoes because, again, this is a desirable trait in this population of individuals. So, she acquired small feet through foot binding. Does that mean when she has kids, her kids are going to have small feet? No, because her genes had her making a larger foot. She changed this foot, and she can't, by binding it, she didn't change the genes present in that foot. Instead, she just changed the structure of the foot through physical processes that can't be passed down. So, you can dye your hair blue. Does that mean your kid's going to have blue hair? No. You can do sunless tanners all day, every day. Does that mean your kid's going to be born with a tan? No. You can't pass down acquired characteristics unless there is a change in the genes within what's known as the germline. And so, again, he's wrong about the method. You can't pass down acquired characteristics, but populations can change over time if the genes change over time. Okay. So what is evolution? It's just changing a population over time. We can see it in labs today with bacteria. We can see it in the fossil records as we look back billions of years within the fossil record. The oldest fossils are 3.5 billion years old. And so we've got a lot of time to see change in that population over time. One of the misconceptions that a lot of students have, and we always get this one question, well, if man came from monkeys, why do monkeys still exist? Well, there's this process called adaptive radiation where one species can give rise to a bunch of new species. And so a common ancestor doesn't just make one species, it can make a bunch of different species if they all change in slightly different directions. We changed in our own direction, going bipedal, getting the larger brain case, getting smarter, and yet screwing over the earth all at the same time, chimps and bonobos, who are the most closely related organisms to us, they're following their own evolutionary past. We and chimpanzees share a common ancestor, but we're not saying that we came from monkeys. We're saying we came from a common ancestor that gave rise to all the primates, not just to human beings. Okay. So Darwin, I had you guys watch a video about Darwin so you could kind of understand the turmoil he felt as he was going on a journey that made him seasick, as he contracted diseases, probably because he ate things like armadillos while he was in South America. He had gone to seminary school. He was a devout believer in God, and yet he still believed that things could change over time. So most of his evidence that he collected while he was traveling around on the Beagle. And the Beagle was supposed to be mapping out South America and trying to find a faster route to India from Europe. As they were traveling around and doing the mapping, he would go out and he would collect organisms and he would collect fossils. There's a ton of samples that Darwin collected in museums over in the United Kingdom at this point. He wrote a lot of books, but the book that gave his idea about natural selection is called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. I'm okay if you just call it On the Origin of Species. I really wish that high schools would have students read at least some excerpts of this book, but instead they have you guys reading a whole slew of fiction that is ridiculous, but that's just my opinion, of course. The first chunk of his book, he talks about pigeons, and the reason he does pigeons was at the time that he was writing this book, people bred pigeons kind of like today we breed dogs. They bred carrier pigeons that could take notes to people and then bring them back. They bred pigeons that had fancy tail feathers and fancy feet feathers and like more iridescent feathers. Like they bred them for a whole slew of different reasons. Darwin was trying to say, well, you guys know that we can change pigeons by selectively breeding them together to get the traits that we want. That's called artificial selection. So if you know that we can change pigeons over time, do you see how logically it's possible that nature that changes over time could also change species over vast tracts of time? So nature could select for specific traits within populations. And it's a very strong argument because we know we can change dogs, we can change pigeons, we can change cows, we can change horses. Well, if we can change things over time, it stands to reason the environment changing can also change species over time. So the mechanism that he proposed was natural selection. So this story was one of the ones mentioned in the video. He was eating an armadillo, I think off the coast of Argentina, one of those South American countries. And he realized he had collected a fossil where the shell of the fossil looked an awful lot like the shell of the armadillo that he was currently eating. So the fossil that he had collected was a chunk of a glyptodont, which this is a glyptodont up here. It's a giant, huge kind of armadillo. So you don't find fossils of those in the United Kingdom. You don't find them in the United States. You find them in South America where they have things like this. So this is not the same species of armadillo that we have. I want to say it's called a fairy armadillo. It can actually roll itself up into a complete ball, unlike ours that we have here in Texas. But what he was showing was nature selected for smaller species over time, and so eventually the glyptodont became a smaller critter that eventually became populations of these really small things. So back during the last ice age, there was a benefit to being huge. It helped you retain your body heat better. But as the glaciers all melted and the climate warmed, that advantage goes away, and the advantage actually becomes to be smaller because then you can radiate off your heat better and maintain your temperature better. And so nature selected for essentially dwarfism in armadillos over time. Charles Lyell and Thomas Malthus is the next little blurb that you guys have in your notes. So as Darwin was sailing around on the Beagle, he was reading books by a whole bunch of different people, and Lyell and Malthus were two of the people that helped him develop arguments behind how nature could select for things over time. So Lyell was a geologist, and if you go back to biblical scholars, they think that the Earth is 6,000 years old. Lyell showed that Earth is way older than that. In fact, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Now, the reason why this is important for Darwin is if you've had 4.5 billion years to change populations over time, it's really easy to understand that you've had plenty of time to go from a prokaryotic cell to a eukaryotic cell, from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms, from plants and fungi and animals that were really simple without vascular tissue, or they stayed really small, to larger organisms that do have vascular tissue and are more advanced. So essentially, Lyell says we've got the time to do all of that change. Now, Malthus. He is often read in history classes even today. He wrote this essay on the principle of population. And what he was pointing out is if you get to have too many of any organism, there ends up being competition for limited resources. So Malthus was arguing that if we get to have too many people in the UK, we're going to have famine, there's going to be war, and people are going to start to die. It kind of goes along with the tragedy of the commons thing that I know is still usually discussed in high school classes. So what Malthus is saying is humans will compete for resources when there get to be too many humans. Well, Darwin thought if there can be competition amongst people, there can be competition amongst other animals and plants and fungi as well. And so that competition can set up a survival of the fittest situation that can select for the fastest, the strongest, the smartest, the best, essentially. So we've got lots of time, and we've got competition that is going to make only the best survive and be able to reproduce and pass their genes on to the next generation. I'm going to skip that one. So nowadays we've got YouTube and we've got more realistic representations of what nature is really like out there in the real world. And nature is brutal. I have seen videos where a gazelle was giving birth while she was being hunted, and as soon as the large cat got close enough, she squirted that baby out and she ran. She was like, "Here, big cat, have my baby, and I'm going to go survive and live another day to hopefully have another kid a little bit later on." All of that trial and tribulation and competition again sets up a survival of the fittest. That mom was very fit. She gave birth real fast. She ran away real fast. She survived to live another day and potentially pass her genes on to the next generation. Hopefully she'll try to give birth in a better place or with more animals around her next time so that that baby can survive. But that's essentially what Lyell and Malthus are showing us, is that the world is brutal and we've had time. So the idea of fitness from an evolutionary standpoint isn't you can run the fastest mile or you can run for the longest period of time. It's you can leave behind babies that have your genes. So this is Strangles. Strangles lives in the AMP lab. And when you feed him a rat, or a mouse, in this case this was a mouse, usually the mouse tries to climb the tree and get as far away from Strangles as possible. This one, though, decided to climb on Strangles. Do you think that's a fit decision for this mouse to do? No, it got eaten way faster than any other mouse that we have ever put into that cage. And so it was a dumb mouse, it died that much sooner. So fitness, there's a lot of different features that play into that, from camouflage and hiding abilities and noting your territory. And yes, being strong and fast can be in there if it helps you to survive and avoid predation, which in this case it would have. But it all amounts to all of those traits just make you more likely to be able to find a mate and have some babies and pass your genes on to the next generation. An adaptation is a feature that an organism has that allows it to kind of fit in with the environment a little bit better. So one day as I was driving out to my car, this was back when I still had a Prius, but I found this little guy on the hubcap of my car. It has adaptations to live in a specific place, not the hubcap of my car. Like, look at it, and where do you think it is adapted for? Hopefully you're thinking something like a bush, a shrub, a tree, something like that. Like, it even has fake leaf veins in it to try to blend in with the leaves that are in a bush. I have a crepe myrtle right next to my car. If it had been in the crepe myrtle, I wouldn't have seen it, and neither would the mockingbird that ate this thing as I was walking out to my car would have seen it. And so adaptations only work if they help you match with the environment that you're living in. If the environment changes, like let's say a fire comes through and all the bushes, trees, and shrubs die because of the fire, this guy's not adapted for that anymore, and so it's not going to survive as easily because it's easier to see it against a burnt backdrop. So adaptations are environment dependent. Natural selection. This goes back to environment dependent. Nature either selects for you or against you, essentially. If you are a faster runner, you can get away from the cheetah doesn't eat you. If you're a giraffe with a taller neck, you can reach the higher branches and get the leaves that much better. but you can't choose to make your neck longer so you can reach those things, because you can't change your anatomy once you're born with it, minus surgery that humans can do at this point. So I just choose this one just because there used to be these awards that were called the Darwin Awards. They were given to people who usually were doing something really stupid and they died in the process, and this is one of those guys. I actually have no idea if he died in the process, but if you were to go up and just grab a random's lion tail, I guarantee that lion would eat you right after this. So nature selected against your stupidity and you got wiped out, and because you're dead, it's going to be a lot harder for you to make babies and pass your genes on to the next generation. Next year, what are the 3 observations about populations that are mentioned in the book? These are them. Pause the video and make sure you get them, but I'll kind of hit these a little bit over time. Populations tend to increase in size over time, assuming that resources are okay. The problem with that is eventually resources become limited. You start to run out of food, you start to run out of clean drinking water. Once those resources are limited, you have higher levels of competition for those limited resources. Genetics plays a huge role in evolution, and so kind of hitting some of those things. Individuals within a population share certain traits, like human beings have a gene that allows us to make melanin that can protect us from sunlight. We have genes that help us make rods and cones in our eyes, so not only can we can see color that helps us figure out which foods haven't spoiled and which foods have. Those are all traits that we have, and they're based on our genes. We vary in the details of those genes, and so some people make more melanin, some people make less. That's kind of the basis for skin color and all the variation within that. Some people's cones don't work correctly, so they don't see color, and so they're not allowed to be pilots. There's a whole bunch of variation within any of the traits that we have. Well, some of the varieties give you better advantages in different places. Going back to skin color, y'all know me, I'm a super duper pale person. Well, my skin color gives me an advantage if I start to move farther north, or in the southern hemisphere way farther south. And that's because my pale skin allows me to harvest sunlight better so that I can make more vitamin D, which can help me with my calcium homeostasis better. However, if I live, well, in Texas where I live currently, my pale skin is actually a detriment, and I've already had skin cancer as a result of that. And so the habitat that I'm living in really isn't suited for my current genes. However, skin cancer kills you later on, and I've already had my kid, so I'm a fit person, I guess. Next up, the inferences that you can make based on the observations that Darwin noticed as he was traveling around. Some of those traits, again, make you better able to survive. If you live longer, you tend to leave more babies behind. Since you left more babies behind that have your genes, that means your genes become more common in the population over time. And so this is your mechanism behind natural selection and how it works. Survive long enough to make babies, make your babies with your genes that allowed you to make more babies become more common in the population over time. Okay. At that point, we kind of come back to fossils and talk about the different ways that fossils can form. Generally speaking, what happens is minerals seep into hard structures and then leave like a cast behind of what we had in there. So it's about the minerals that are present within the fossils. The structures that fossilize really well tend to be skeletal, like an exoskeleton. Think shells, like this is a nautilus. I showed you earlier ammonite fossils. Well, ammonites were related to nautiloids, which this is again a nautilus. And so we have lots of fossils of them because their shell happened to fossilize really well. Any vertebrate that has a nice bony skeleton, if the conditions are right in the place where they die, their bones tend to fossilize very well. But skin doesn't. Soft tissue doesn't. So things like slugs, they don't fossilize very well. Jellyfish, they don't fossilize very well. So you tend to need to have a hard structure in order for the fossil to form. One of the things that we can do with fossils is date it to find out how old the fossil was. We talked about this a little bit last semester. But what we do, and we've got different radioisotopes. I'm going to use carbon-14 as an example, but carbon-14 has a half-life of approximately 5,700 years. If we find a fossil and it has 50% the amount of carbon-14 in it that we would expect of a modern sample, that would tell us that that fossil was about 5,700 years old. If we only find 25% the amount of carbon-14 left in there, that would tell us that this fossil is about 11,000 years old. Now you can only use carbon-14 to date things that are about 20,000 years old. Pardon me. But again, we have different isotopes that we can use that have different half-lives, and so we can use other radioisotopes to help us date older materials. Okay, excuse me. Plate tectonics kind of goes back to Lyell and his geography, and Earth is older. Dang it. Than we thought it was. So plate tectonics is sort of misconstrued as being continental drift. Continental drift is an old school theory that isn't in use anymore, but it's kind of like plate tectonics. What it shows us is that the land on Earth consists of these plates, and these plates move around over time. About, I want to say it was like 250 million years ago, all of the plates had merged together to make one giant supercontinent called Pangaea. And then since that time, those continents have been moving farther apart. As they move apart, though, they go to different places. Like Antarctica used to be closer to the equator. So the climate was very different in Antarctica back then than it is right now. And that plays a role in how the species that are found in that area are going to change over time. So Pangaea, so yeah, about 250 million years ago is when Pangaea formed and all the continents were merged together. What happened after that is the continents started to drift apart, and we drifted into a northern landmass called Laurasia, and then a southern landmass called Gondwana. And again, notice continents, as they're moving around, they go to different places. Remember that the equator tends to get the most amount of sunlight, and so it tends to have our tropical regions. And notice that Antarctica used to be closer to it than it currently is. Now it's polar, which it's as far away from the equator as it can possibly get. And so as the continents move around, the environment in certain areas changes over time. Now, another example that I gave you guys way earlier, we used to have a shallow sea in the area in Texas where we live currently, but now it's land and the shallow sea is long gone. And so you used to find different species that lived in our area back then when we were a shallow sea than you do now. The geologic timescale is essentially the history of life on Earth, but in rocks. The Grand Canyon has all of these really clearly visible strata in them. Each strata can be dated to a specific time period. And when you go all the way down to the very bottom, there's 2 billion years of history in the walls of the Grand Canyon. However, there's also a chunk of time that's missing from the Grand Canyon for some reason. But you can find a lot of different fossils from a lot of different kinds of organisms because 2 billion years worth of time have existed since this canyon first started to form. Next I gave you this. This is sort of a very brief overview of the geologic timescale. So eons are huge periods of time. The Archean eons, back when only prokaryotes existed on Earth. Proterozoic, we start to get our eukaryotic cells and life starts to get more complex. Phanerozoic is the eon we are still currently in. Phanerozoic we know a little bit more about because the fossil record's a little bit more complete. So we've divided it into a few eras. The oldest of those is the Paleozoic era. Then we've got the Mesozoic, this is when the dinos did their thing, and we are currently still in the Cenozoic era. Each of our eras can be subdivided into periods. Now I'm only giving you the periods that are in the red boxes. There's a lot of arguments about what's going on in our periods today, and in fact these names pardon me, aren't routinely used anymore, and so I'm not holding you responsible for those. There's also epochs. We're not going to talk about the epochs. I just kind of want you to read through the sidelines so you can see the trend. What I told you earlier was life started out very simply, and it got more complex over time. So we started out with prokaryotes, well then we got eukaryotes. Then our single-celled eukaryotes became multi-celled eukaryotes. We started out in water, we moved out onto land. Once we had land, we had even fiercer competition and we had different struggles, but we started to get a whole bunch of new species because all of these new habitats opened up that hadn't existed before. Anytime we go from one era to a next, there is a huge mass extinction that kills off most of the species on life. But it's very important you understand not everything dies, just a bunch of different things died. Like when the dinosaurs died, there were crocodiles. They're still alive today, but we've lost all the dinosaurs. And so it's important that you understand major extinction or mass extinction doesn't mean everything goes extinct. It just means a bunch of different things go extinct. The other thing that I want to mention as we're looking at this, most of these mass extinctions had to do with climate change. Either the climate got more oxygen in it or it got more carbon dioxide in it, and as a result the climate warmed over time, and then things die off because of that. This is important because whether you believe it or not, the climate is changing and becoming warmer, and every time that has happened that we can find in the fossil record, there has been a mass extinction event. Okay. Homologous structures are the things we study during comparative anatomy. So these are just the similar structures due to common ancestry that I had alluded to earlier. Analogous structures are things that tend to confuse people as they're looking at evolutionary relationships because they're features that look similar, but they're not similar due to relationships or common ancestry. So all of these guys have wings, and so you might think that they're related to each other because they have wings, and yet their wings are entirely different structures. Like a bat uses its hand to make its wing. The bird uses its whole arm to make its wing, and so they're using different features to make those wings. You can even see the finger bones in the bat that's being used to make the wing that I'm talking about there. Butterfly, on the other hand, entirely different structures. Legs, instead, are basically going to be modified into these wings off down here. So they're things that confuse people into thinking things are related, even though they're not related. Now, one of, in my opinion, the most strong pieces of evidence that helps to support the idea of evolution is molecules. So a lot of different organisms have very similar proteins, and the proteins are coded for by genes, and so they have very similar genes. Like most human beings have the same gene for human insulin, because if you change a gene, you change the product, and then typically speaking, bad things start to happen to organisms. And so we conserve things that are very important and have similarities in those things. So we can look at the DNA. Now this is actually the amino acid sequence. The amino acid sequence is determined by the DNA. Here's the way I'm going to explain this one to you. If we look at your DNA and we compare it to every single person's DNA on the planet, who's going to have DNA that is most similar to you? Well, it's going to be your parents, because your parents made you. And then from there, it's going to be like brothers, sisters, cousins, but we can see who's related to who. That's the whole basis behind how like Ancestry and 23andMe work, is they're looking at DNA similarities. Well, take that out farther. Your grandparents have DNA that's fairly similar to you. Your great-grandparents, the DNA is getting to be more different. Your great-great-grandparents, things get more different. Well, eventually, you start talking about great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great. Their DNA is going to be different enough from yours that they might not even show up as related to you when you look at their DNA. So you start looking at some different things. Almost all organisms on the planet use the same genetic code. That is a piece of evidence that supports the idea of what's known as LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. And that ancestor used the genetic code that we still use today, and everything on the planet uses that same genetic code, with a couple of exceptions that have mutated and done their own separate thing. So we can do things with genes like figure out when did HIV first jump into people and then change over time. We look at DNA analysis to figure out like how many strains of coronavirus that's currently circulating, like where did it come from? If we got it in Texas, did it come from Washington State or did it come from China? We can figure out which viral strains are more related to others based on molecular evidence. And so it's a really strong piece of evidence that helps to support that idea that populations change over time. Okay. I'm going to be posting a follow-up quiz to one that we took earlier in the semester. Hopefully you guys will make improvements on this as you grade it this time. So be on the lookout for that.